Every 2 years, the California High-Speed Rail Authority is required to submit an updated business plan. The 2016 business plan for the California High-Speed Rail system makes some significant changes, both in where the train will go first and how much it will cost. Will the new plan help California's high-speed rail system arrive on time and on budget? We'll ask Jeff Morales, the CEO of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and Jessica Peters from the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office. High-speed rail's new business plan. Necessary detour or off the tracks?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the State Capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. A lot has happened since high-speed rail was first passed by the voters in 2008. What is the project's current status and what is its plan going forward? Our guest is Jessica Peters, who's an expert on high-speed rail with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So, Jessica, let me ask you this. Let's provide a little background for our audience. What were the initial requirements of Prop 1A way back in 2008?
Sure. Proposition 1A, in addition to providing partial funding for the high-speed rail project, established certain criteria that the high-speed rail system is intended to ultimately achieve. Okay. So, for example, the measure requires the use of electric trains that are capable of traveling at least 200 miles an hour.
Yeah, I find that word, as a lawyer, I find that word interesting. Capable. It doesn't mean they have to always go, that fast, but they have to be capable of doing that.
Yeah, correct. They would obviously need to slow down.
It's also the distance between San Francisco and Los Angeles. We often hear about 2 hours and 40 minutes that commute, but it has to be capable of doing that. That doesn't have to do that on a regular basis. Yeah,
that would be the nonstop travel time between San Francisco and LA.
Right, but there are a few other things they had there as well. One of them was not supposed to require a subsidy, correct?
That's correct. That's another major provision of Proposition 1A. It has to be able, the train has to be able to operate without any sort of operating subsidy.
Now, the way they set this up initially was it was going to be phased in. So there was going to be a phase 1 and a phase 2. So can you tell us about the two phases and when and where they were going to go and how much they were going to cost?
Sure. Proposition 1A established the two phases. Phase 1 is from San Francisco to Anaheim, and phase 2 would have two legs, one connecting up to Sacramento in the north and another connecting to San Diego in the south. At the time Proposition 1A was passed by voters, the most recent cost estimate for the project for the entire system at that time was about $45 billion. And at the time the measure passed, the High-Speed Rail Authority didn't have any particular schedule for the completion of the project.
And that number's jumped up and down. It's gone up as high as like 98 billion, then it went down.
Correct.
Now it's around 64 billion. Correct. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's continue on this process. So, okay, so they got phase 1, yes, which is going to be basically from, it was San Francisco to Anaheim. And they had to first build a section of that called the initial operating segment. So where was that first initial operating segment planned, and why did they choose that location?
Sure. The High-Speed Rail Authority plans to build phase 1 in different segments or sections, okay, and they initially had proposed to operate a segment of the system between Merced in the northern part of the Central Valley and about San Fernando near Los Angeles area.
People like to joke it's the train to nowhere, going to Merced or wherever. So okay, but Merced is a place, but people, yes, often talked about that. But okay. So that was the initial operating segment. So why did they choose that location? Why the valley?
So one of the reasons that they chose that as the initial operating segment is by connecting into the Los Angeles area. They projected that they would have higher ridership due to the population density down there, as well as being able to bridge a gap in the existing passenger rail service between Northern and Southern California through the valley.
Yeah, anybody who's ever taken the Amtrak knows that they have to get off at Bakersfield, take a bus to Los Angeles, and that is a problem in the rail system in California for sure.
Correct.
Let me ask you about this. So then within that, there's this 130-mile segment they were going to build from Madera to northern Bakersfield, about $6 billion, 130 miles. How is that going to be paid for?
So that would be paid for with a combination of federal and state funds. So the High-Speed Rail Authority actually received about $3.5 billion in federal grants, with most of that going to that Central Valley segment, which is actually currently under construction. In addition, the state would match those grant funds with state funds from Proposition 1A. or potentially other state sources.
Okay, and then we build out the rest of the initial operating segment from Merced to Anaheim. That was going to cost, part of phase one, going to cost $31 billion. How are they planning to pay for that?
So that total $31 billion cost, the High-Speed Rail Authority never had a full funding plan for that. They conceptually had contemplated seeking additional federal grants or leveraging some sort of private investment, but a full funding plan for that initial operating segment was never identified by the authority.
Okay, so now we have to go kind of fast forward here, and we have to make sure the plan is on track, no pun intended. And the High-Speed Rail Authority is statutorily required to prepare an updated business plan every even year.
Correct.
So we're in an even year. What is that plan supposed to include? What are the elements of a basic business plan?
Sure. So generally speaking, the plan is required to have a construction plan, including the capital costs for the system, as well as the proposed schedule for constructing the system. They're also required to identify funding sources, as well as have some discussion of the potential risks to completing the project.
Okay, so now we have a new business plan this year. What are the major features of the 2016 business plan?
Sure. So there's 4 major features of the plan that we have identified. And the first and probably the biggest one is that it changes that initial operating segment.
They're changing direction.
Exactly. Instead of connecting Merced into the Los Angeles area, the existing portion of the system that's under construction in the Central Valley will instead be connected to the north into San Jose.
Okay, we're going north, not south. Okay,
Exactly.
What else did it do?
They update the capital cost for completing phase 1 of the system. As you referenced earlier, the new updated capital cost is $64 billion.
It was $68 billion.
Yes, so they've brought it down a little bit, and then also updated the completion estimate for phase 1 to the year 2029.
They extended that a little bit.
Correct. And then for funding that remainder of phase 1, they assume that additional funding will be identified, but they do identify full funding for the initial operating segment to San Jose.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to ask the High-Speed Rail Authority CEO, Jeff Morales, why those changes were made. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. This year, the High-Speed Rail Authority updated its business plan with some major changes. The change that got everyone's attention was the about face, changing the first operating segment from the Central Valley to Los Angeles to instead having high-speed rail built north from the Central Valley to the Silicon Valley. Our guest is Jeff Morales, the CEO of the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and he's here to tell us why they made that change, as well as some other things. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
So overall, the authority's new business plan says that the entire build-out of Los Angeles to San Francisco Phase 1 is going to be $4 billion cheaper than the previous plan. Where'd that $4 billion savings come from?
Well, part of it is we're 2 years further along in the process. We have the project that much more defined, and we also have the benefit now of having let actual contracts and having construction underway. And what we've seen is by engaging the private sector in that process through a design-build process, let them bring creativity and innovation into it. They've identified cost savings measures, and so where we can, where appropriate, we've applied those elsewhere in the program, and we're going to continue to do that. And my goal, frankly, is to continue to bring the cost of delivering this down.
Yeah, $4 billion is quite a bit of money. Now, according to the new business plan, the key reasons for you going north to the Silicon Valley instead of south to Los Angeles for this initial operating segment was, number one, lower cost, $10 billion cheaper to do, and fewer technological challenges. Also, apparently it's 50 miles shorter. So why is this new northern route going to take about 3 years longer to build?
Well, it really is about the cost, and one of the things, the most significant thing about this plan is it's the first time, because of the commitment by the legislature of cap and trade funds, it's the first time we can actually project out and say we have sufficient funds available through existing sources to get to operations. Before we had projected out and had unidentified sources. And so projecting out what we know will be available to us, we match that up against capital costs, and what that says is it's less expensive to build the northern leg, so that's what we're going to build.
But it's going to take 3 years longer. Why is it going to take 3 years longer? Because the technological challenges don't seem as great going to the Silicon Valley as it was going to Los Angeles.
It is generally speaking more straightforward, but it's really a reflection of exactly where we are in the environmental approval processes. And also based on now what we can project as funding, what funding will be on an annual basis, and establish a more realistic or a realistic schedule based on all the updated factors.
Now, within that initial operating segment, there's a first construction segment. And that first construction segment is about 12 miles shorter than the previous initial construction segment, but the cost is $1.4 billion more. Why?
Right. Well, there are two things at play there. One, we shortened the segment on the southern end toward Bakersfield as part of an agreement with the city of Bakersfield. They had sued about the initial alignment that we had were proceeding with. We've now been working with them to identify another alignment, and so we needed that space to be able to work that out. That's the distance. The cost is because we've gone now from what was originally funded by the federal government was actually a non-electrified segment through the valley. There wasn't enough money to electrify. The additional cost you see is moving to true high-speed rail.
Okay. Now, the authority's updated business plan also identifies funding to pay for the entire Silicon Valley to Central Valley segment. Could you go over those numbers for our audience?
Sure. We've got three sources of funding that are available to the program today. One are the Proposition 1A bond funds, about $8 billion that's available for construction. Then we have federal funding, about $3.5 billion, and now the cap and trade funding. And combined, looking out over the horizon, we see about little over $20 billion, and almost $21 billion through those combined sources available to us. And that segment will cost a little under $20 billion.
Right, that's the $10 billion savings. The other segment, the original one was $31 billion. But you worried at all about cap and trade?
We have, the legislature took a very important step by committing on a continuing basis, meaning we don't have to get an appropriation every year for it, not only for high-speed rail, but for other programs. And so that's what we're moving forward based on. There's some question about the continuation of cap and trade, but the legislature committed it to us on an ongoing basis, and that's our assumption.
You're taking their word for it.
We're
okay.
Taking their word.
You know, the updated business plan, so it's $21 billion going from Central Valley to the Silicon Valley. But it assumes some funding, some additional funding to pay for the $43 billion it's going to cost to build out the entire phase one of San Francisco to Los Angeles. What are some of the potential sources of funding you're looking at to fill in that $43 billion hole?
Right. From the beginning, when Prop 1A passed, there was a presumption, and what was laid out for the voters was a general premise of about 1/3 state, 1/3 federal, and 1/3 private. And what you're seeing materialize is, in this plan, is the third, that's the state money, is in fact materializing. Our estimates show that we can reasonably project that same level, somewhere between $12 to $20 billion of private money coming in based on the operation of the system. And so we're looking at private investment to build out the rest of the system. We also do expect the federal government to get back in the game.
Yeah, it's interesting that I was reading some statistics that said the federal government paid 90% of the funding for the interstate highway system, but not so much for high-speed rail.
No, right. Historically, right, the federal government was a major player. 90, in some cases 100% of the interstate system was built with federal money. If there were no new federal money in this program and we finish it, it would be less than a 5% contribution.
That's quite a difference.
That doesn't make any sense when you're talking about a region that has, like California, that has, 20% of the national gross domestic product is coming out of California. The federal government should be investing.
Okay, well, up next, we're going to hear what the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office thinks about the new high-speed rail business plan. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Any major infrastructure project invites scrutiny and skepticism, and high-speed rail has been no exception. So does high-speed rail's new updated business plan quell or exacerbate those concerns? We're talking with Jessica Peters with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst Office and an expert on the high-speed rail project. So let's talk about this redirecting of the project from LA essentially to the Bay Area. Was that a good idea to change directions?
Well, there's trade-offs. Obviously, connecting the train into Los Angeles would have had much higher projected ridership. However, because the High-Speed Rail Authority has not been able to identify the funding to complete that segment, switching to a lower cost segment does have some merit.
And that's about a $10 billion savings, correct?
Correct. The capital cost of going to San Jose instead of the LA area is about $10 billion lower.
And why do you think the lower cost is technologically a little easier to get to San Jose than it is to, go to LA through the mountains?
That's our understanding. Just the what's required to get there, crossing into the Los Angeles basin is very technologically complex.
We were talking about the $64 billion now that they're saying it's going to, the capital cost for a new schedule for phase one. What do you think about those costs? Are those projected costs and their completion schedule, are they reasonable?
With regard to the projected cost, we know that others, such as the statutorily required peer review group, have actually reviewed the overall methodology that high-speed rail uses to come up with their cost estimates and found that the methodology is reasonable. But it's really important to remember that this is a point-in-time estimate, and they're very early in the project, and many of the factors that can affect the ultimate cost of the project have yet to be finalized or decided.
So we still don't quite know. What about the authority's assertion that they've identified funding sources for entirely for this Central Valley to Silicon Valley segment? Are the numbers real?
So the authority has identified a full funding plan for the initial operating segment to San Jose. And while this is a more complete funding plan than they have presented for any other operable segment of the system in the past, there's some uncertainty, in particular with the reliance on cap and trade auction revenues for the project.
And cap and trade is a huge part of this project.
Yes, it's a substantial amount of the funding that they would plan to use for this initial operating segment.
And my understanding with cap and trade is a quarter of the cap and trade revenues are designated for high-speed rail.
That's correct.
And in I was reading about a recent auction they had, and it didn't go so well. They only sold 2% of the credits they thought they were going to sell. So, and that becomes an issue. Is that because they're not sure that that cap and trade is going to go beyond 2020? Is there a concern because the legislation ends at 2020 that cap and trade can't be projected out to 2050?
Yeah, I'm not sure we can really speculate on why the auction went the way that it did, or what other market forces are taking place.
We're professors;
there.
we speculate all the time.
But I think that it is an issue that needs to be considered. With that, the cap and trade program, as far as we understand it, is not authorized beyond 2020. And in terms of high-speed rail's reliance on these funds, they're counting on these revenues being available until the year 2050.
Right, long way out. So High-Speed Rail Authority also assumes additional funding is going to become available to complete the Los Angeles to San Francisco segment. How realistic are those assumptions that they're making?
Yeah, so if the High-Speed Rail Authority is able to fully fund and build out the initial operating segment, that would leave them a funding gap of roughly $44 billion to complete the remainder of the system from the Valley into Southern California. That's a lot of money, and so it could be very difficult for them to secure that amount of funding, in particular on the timeline that they're estimating. So in order to meet the 2029 completion date for the entire Phase 1 system from San Francisco to Anaheim, they would need to begin construction on the remainder of Phase 1 in 2018. And so the likelihood that they will have identified, multiple billions of additional dollars in funding in the next 2 years.
So what you're talking about is that section essentially south by Bakersfield going to LA. They'd have to start that in 2018.
That is what they have said, yes. It takes them about 11 years to construct the remainder of the system. And so identifying that amount of money in such a short time seems unlikely.
They're also expecting some federal funds, and I'm just wondering how realistic that is given the way Congress has viewed high-speed rail, and controlled by Republicans, generally not supportive. Let me ask you this. Going forward, where do you think the state legislature should be focusing its oversight?
Sure. We think that there's two important areas for the legislature in terms of oversight. One is just understanding the total magnitude of costs on the project. So that $64 billion cost estimate that we've talked about is just the capital cost or the construction cost, how much the High-Speed Rail Authority is going to pay to its contractors. Well, their business plan identifies some sort of financing scheme that they will use, and it appears in their plan that there's at least like $7 billion in financing costs just for that initial operating segment. There's also administrative costs, and there could be additional financing costs. And so we think the legislature needs a more complete picture of the total costs. In addition, we think that the legislature needs information provided in a way that is comparable over time. So if you look at the business plans that are provided every other year,
because they keep changing the segments, you don't know if you're comparing apples to apples.
Exactly, you're not comparing apples to apples, and it's really impossible to tell if they're staying on budget and on schedule, and when the numbers look like maybe they aren't, it's really difficult to determine why.
Very interesting. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the future challenges and opportunities of high-speed rail. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Jeff Morales, the CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority. Getting the project done on time and on budget is a concern. Acquiring land in a timely manner has been a challenge, frankly, for high-speed rail. So how do you respond to your critics that say that the slow pace of land acquisition is putting the project at risk?
Well, there's no question that the property acquisition is one of the biggest risks that we have to manage, and we are. But we're moving through that.
Has the pace picked up?
The pace has picked up dramatically. We had some initial slowdowns, frankly, because of lawsuits, which prevented access to our funding and slowed the process down, but we're moving forward very briskly now and acquiring, and that's the basis for $3 billion worth of work being under construction now in the Valley.
That's a lot of money. But what about those lawsuits? Are they another possible impediment? Are they going to derail the project?
Well, what we've seen so far is the key lawsuits that had potentially threatened the program. In fact, we prevailed on those.
You've had some success recently.
We have, and we always were confident that we would prevail, but of course you have to work through that process.
Got to wait till it happens, right? Till the judge rules. It does, though, high-speed rail, for all of its challenges, does provide some unique opportunities. One is really the housing crisis that California we've been discussing now for quite some time, that the price of homes in the Silicon Valley, very, very high, and it's chasing people out with the workers that they need. What are the real estate implications of high-speed rail?
Well, that's one of the things that has gotten people very excited in the Bay Area in particular about, given the jobs housing imbalance, and the fact that there are so many people today who commute from Merced and Stockton and areas.
That's actually getting to be a normal commute.
Yeah, and what.
And that's
what
a long time in your car, by the way.
That's a very long time, and one of the things that this system will do is, Merced will now be about 42 minutes from San Jose, as opposed to a 3-hour, trip. But what we'll also see is companies not only drawing from a workforce in the Valley, but also shifting some operations into the Valley. That's something that Ashley Swearingen in Fresno, for instance, is very focused on, is attracting business to Fresno and taking advantage of what will be new connections between the two areas.
I came here many years ago from Connecticut, and they have a lot of corporate headquarters in Stamford. One of the reasons they have so many corporate headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, is the executives were tired of going into New York at their corporate offices, and they moved the offices to Stamford. Right. So could that be a harbinger for something in the Valley? Who knows? Maybe so. Another possible opportunity for the valleys is dealing with chronic unemployment. And what a lot of people talk about when they talk about that is this high-speed rail maintenance chart. Everybody seems to want it. They're calling it the golden goose because of these potential 1,500 high-paying jobs. So how close is the board to making a decision, and what criteria are the board going to use?
That decision's still a little way off, but we will be moving ahead. And it's not just the maintenance facility. There are a number of different facilities. Once we are in operation, we're talking about permanent jobs associated just with running the train. There are going to be upwards of 4,000 or so jobs that are connected, 3,000, excuse me, connected with operation, and those facilities will be spread throughout the state. About a third of them probably in the Central Valley, but there'll also be some in the Bay Area and in Southern California. So long-term, permanent injection into the local economies coming from just the operation of the train.
Well, the other issue that they talk about sometimes is whether trains could actually be manufactured here in California. Have companies expressed an interest in doing that? I don't think there are any companies right now that manufacture high-speed rail in the United States, but are there companies considering maybe producing some of those high-speed rail cars here in California or the United States?
Absolutely, and we are doing and will do everything we possibly can to incentivize that and encourage it. One of the advantages of going first and being the first high-speed rail system will be we want to become the home of that industry in the U.S. The manufacturing and all of the associated things, much the way the Southern California economy got such a boost from the aerospace industry.
Right, that was big, and I think that I was reading that the average cost of these European trains are $30 to $70 million each. So we're talking about significant amount of money just for one train, and so I assume a very educated workforce to go with it.
Right, and all the supply chain associated with it, and then the support services. And one of the things we're doing as we develop the system too is try to make sure that we're getting as much benefit invested back into the local economy as possible. And one of the ways is through small business participation. We have 266 and counting small businesses under contract. Small businesses tend to be local, and that's what we're seeing. And so what we're seeing are local firms in the Valley getting work, expanding their workforces, and growing and preparing for future work.
And that money recirculates in the local economy. I mean, there's a multiplier effect with that money. So anyway, some possible good news if we get it done. Well, I want to thank Jeff Morales, the CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority, for joining us, as well as Jessica Peters from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or get our e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.